want to make sure that I especially thank my committee and my faculty members and my peers. I feel like this is kind of a thing that we all go through together in graduate school, and I wouldn't be standing here, especially not 6 months earlier than my peers, if I didn't have really strong cohort behind me. I also, even though none of them were present, I want to mention that a lot of people out actually in North Dakota where these photos were taken were integral to the process of producing this work and really evolving my own research. The work that you see is all produced pretty much within about a 50-mile radius of Newtown, North Dakota. Newtown is really unique, and it has some personal connection for me, but it also had a very interesting it's a very interesting example of what's happening all over the state at this contemporary moment. So I first went there kind of on my way to Boston to move here. I took this total detour to go up to Newtown and see the area that my grandmother was born in, which was a town called Van Hook, and it's one of 3 smaller towns that kind of merged into one and made Newtown during a time when the Garrison Dam and Reservoir Project was in production. They were building this massive dam, and these areas were going to be flooded. So they moved and they made a new town, and they were really creative with the name, obviously. And it still is known that way today. So I went there with very little knowledge of what the land was going to look like. I just had these stories and this idea that my grandmother's town didn't exist anymore, and it was under this lake. And every time I've been back since, I've kind of found out more information and more kind of truths in terms of my original understanding was that like these houses and buildings were all under this lake. And I actually discovered that no, they picked the houses up and moved them down to the other town and just really relocated everything. So when I was standing there feeling like, oh, you know, if there's a drought, I wonder if you can see these buildings, I was kind of, it was a false assumption. But the land, nonetheless, was really captivating to me. When you're looking out across the horizon, this is one of kind of the biggest, most awe-rendering places I think I've ever been. I don't know that I can describe it with words, and hopefully the pictures do it better than I can, but you just have a sense of how small you are and how grand this landscape is. And especially in places where you see the lake. So this is Lake Sacagawea, that's that flooding I'm talking about. It comes right against the horizon, and it meets it in such a way that it's hard to understand how it even got there. And I think that's really unique to North Dakota, being that it was formerly an inland sea, the way that it takes the water and holds it for this lake, but also at times of flooding when they've had a heavy winter. It's kind of amazing, and those shifts that come from just the climate there and the way that the different seasons are so varied is what really interested me and really pulled me back. So looking at the landscape in a difference of 1 year's time between a really heavy winter and a very mild winter where you saw the first year flooding, and you'll see that in some of the images over there where the water is just rising up to meet the road that's passing through it, versus years where there's drought, and that's what this year was, and you can see some of the foundations for those towns peeking through. You can see these trees growing up in through water. So all of that was there for me. All of that was really interesting to me and drew me back to actually really discover what's going on there now. So there's this history of alteration, but there's also this contemporary moment that we're living in where there's a huge oil boom going on. So the town that I'm looking at, Newtown, is changing. It's one of these towns that's really been impacted by the oil reserves being able to be accessed for the first time. So this is oil that we've known was there for a very long time. It's now we can get at it through hydraulic fracking, which has, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of fracking. That's a huge buzzword right now, and so it's very controversial. So it's changing the kind of what was once a very quiet farming community and a community that was kind of shrinking really into this kind of what they call a boomtown. It's really lots of people coming in, lots of trucks going through, and it's altering everything in a new and different way in contrast to this history. So I hope that that's emblematic in the work, or obvious in the work for people to discuss. But I mostly want to take, at this point, questions, because I think some of the things that I've captured are kind of difficult to understand if you've never been to North Dakota, and I would love to hear people's interpretation and their curiosities about what they see. See if we have anybody who has any. Laura.
Can you talk a little bit about the sort of, you get the sense of you being immersed in the land, not as much a spectator on the outside. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship in the images?
Definitely. I mean, I talked a little bit kind of about the history of it being an inland sea. That's something that was really interesting to me, and I noticed in my research other people who are, poets and people who are writing about this space kind of mention it the same way, that it feels like the ocean. Like you stand in it and you kind of have, instead of having a sense that you're on firm ground, you have the sense that you're drowning in it. And I think that shows sometimes when I'm photographing and how I write the horizon line, because a lot of times I don't. Like I'm looking and you're so within the landscape and the places that I'm hiking into to get the images that I make. Like sometimes I'm not standing in a way where I can look at the horizon in our traditional way, and I really feel kind of like I'm falling into it. And so that's the way I photographed it, and that's the way I read it. It's different. Like I don't think I've ever felt as lonely as I could feel out there anywhere else. And I think that it really is like it is a sense of being on water as opposed to being on land. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You mentioned loneliness, which was something I think I was going to ask you about, because a lot of the images are solitary in terms of one truck.
Mm-hmm.
But I also wondered, were you trying to convey the moving of your grandmother's town? Because you get the motion of the truck and the house being moved.
Right.
And it was interesting to hear you talk about that.
Well, there's definitely, I'm sure that my feeling of being kind of secluded out there comes through just by the nature of me being the one that's making the work. But I am watching these trucks. I am waiting for these moments where there's just one. The trucks in particular, it's just a constant, like always oil trucks and all these trucks coming in moving houses because there's so many people coming in to work in the area. There's a huge housing shortage. So you're seeing all of these like man camps and things being constructed out of these, I would say, semi-permanent to, prefab housing. And it's really very much like the time my grandmother was there. And as I interview people and talk to people, especially folks that are in that older generation who lived through the first relocation there, a lot of them are like, oh, it feels just like 1951, it feels just like when we did this, or they're used to that site, but not from, the last 50 years, it's from that particular time period in their childhood maybe, when they saw this kind of thing happen, this kind of commotion and movement in their town.
I really like the samurai sword in front of the man camps. Why did that catch your eye? How did you think of that?
I'm not sure it is samurai sword. I think it is. I think it's actually like a pole or something that's bent. What caught my eye about that was a man camp that just on the upper part of that ridge, you can start to see that the houses aren't actually connected to the ground yet. It was like in under construction man camp. And with all of the road construction that's happening now, like you can't get to a vantage point a lot of times because it's an open construction site, and they'll get very mad at you if you try to do it. So for me, when I was looking at it, I was looking at kind of the way that the road is just completely falling apart there, and all these things that are, like that was probably a fence post that's been, bulldozed over or something. So I was really interested in even like the interim stage of the construction for these like prefabricated things. Mm-hmm.
Did you have to juggle with different cameras and films to capture what you wanted to do? There's a very like ephemeral quality that's very fragile, like an atmosphere there. How did you want to achieve that, and how did you technically do it?
Well, it's very challenging, actually. I'm also shooting a documentary short about the same landscape that's more specific to the people there. And that's something that we'll be screening in the spring. So I was shooting with the camera that you see that does the square format, which is a twin lens reflex camera, and it's a Mamiya C220. So people who are an older generation, maybe you remember these cameras with the two lenses on the front. I was also shooting with the Mamiya press camera, which shot these larger rectangles that are 6:9 negatives. So I'm juggling those two cameras, but then I was also juggling a digital movie camera for shooting HD and a Super 8 camera. So I actually have some pictures that I should probably post maybe on my website of the cameras all in a row. Because what I would do is I would set up the two, and sometimes I would set up, one to make a panorama almost. I would set them and then I'd move from one to the other. I maybe would start the film camera and then go and shoot the stills, and then turn the other one off and pack it all up. This one in particular, this atmosphere that you see is actually, I'm on somebody's property where they almost hit me with their call line, and then they told me that I could take pictures there. But it's right on the edge of the road construction. All of the brush and anything that was there has been torn up. And what that does in North Dakota, you have these gusts of wind that just come through, so you have, at any given time, these dust storms. So this whole skyline is actually, there's dust from the trucks driving through on the unpaved road, from the wind cutting through kind of this exposed dirt. That's actually like one of the major causes for the Dust Bowl, was that people were told, oh, if you clear away the brush, it will like freshen the earth, and then you'll be able to plant and it'll grow really well. Well, what it did is caused no stability and all that dust to just stir up. So that's kind of part of what's happening now. I don't know, does that answer kind of your question? Certainly a lot of juggling was involved.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It seems like you're going back and forth between subject matter a lot, and there's a lot going on. Is there a subject matter in particular that was the entrance point for your work?
In terms of subject matter,
In terms of, I guess, the political ends of fracking versus landscape and
right. Well, for me,
moving of homes and...
right. Well, for me, I think I'm fairly consistent. It's hard sometimes to articulate it consistently, but I came into it from my own grandmother's history of being born there, her town being relocated and destroyed by this flooding. And then when I came there to look for that, I kind of found out what was happening to the land now. So for me, like the unifying thread, I guess, would be the transition of this landscape and how that's kind of rolling over at this particular moment. Even though the cause is different, I think you see some of the same things. You see houses moving on trucks, for one. And you see just kind of everything shifting one way or the other. I don't know that I would call them being a varying subject matter. I mentioned the fracking, not necessarily to get on the sidetrack of the political nature of that, but to explain why now. Like the drilling, they had an oil boom earlier in the 20th century, and they were able to access only so much of the oil, but they knew there was this much more. The reason it's happening now is because that technology is available. And that creates complicated political issues within the community there, and I think even nationally. But in terms of the focus of the work, I think it really is about the land and how it's transitioning, but also how it has a history of transition. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. And